Hi, everybody. Welcome to Module 7. I want to just take a second to acknowledge how hard you have all been working for the past 7 weeks, 6 weeks or so. I know that dissertation proposal plus a specialization course is a lot of work, but you have been doing some incredible stuff in this course, defining your framework, critiquing it, thinking hard about how it shows up for equity and justice, how it shows up in your research design, visualizing it. It's not easy work. That's the kind of deep conceptual work that many researchers don't go far enough with. And you've done that. So please give yourselves a little bit of, I don't know, some self-celebration for that. So this week, I want to zoom out just a little bit because I think it's really easy to get so focused on the framework itself, on getting it right, or getting the right framework that we lose sight of why it's so important. I know we've talked a lot about different different ways that frameworks are important, but this week is really digging into what's all this theoretical work actually for, ultimately, after the study is done. What is it going to help you do? So the shift I'm asking you to make this week is from thinking about your framework as a research tool to thinking about it as a tool for action and change. And those aren't the same thing. And so we'll talk a little bit about that distinction. Before we go further, though, let's do a quick warm up. When you first chose your theoretical framework, were you thinking about it as a tool for research? Were you thinking about it as compliance, trying to meet the requirements of the dissertation? Or were you thinking about it as a tool for change? And what's the difference there? Okay, so let's talk about consequential research and Milner. Milner is a professor and an education researcher whose work sits right at the intersection of equity, race, and the ethics of research practice. In the piece that you read for this module, he puts forward this idea of consequential research, which I think aligns really well with being scholarly practitioners. He is a former president of AERA, which is the American Educational Research Association. This article that you all read is actually his 2023 AERA presidential address, which gives you a good sense of, I think, how significant it is in the field of education research. So in that article, he introduces a framework, and in that speech, he introduces a framework for designing consequential research. Consequential research is systematic inquiry that's co-planned and co-enacted with the communities being studied, with an explicit aim to identify problems and solve them, right? So it aligns very well with scholar practitioner work. The design of the study and its potential for impact are inseparable from the start. So that's why Milner links design and consequence as concepts that belong together. He also makes an important point that research can be consequential whether or not it was intentionally designed to be, right? And he gives some sobering examples of that, including research that was highly consequential, but also deeply harmful to Black communities. So consequentiality isn't inherently a good thing. It's about intentionality, accountability, who benefits, and you have to be very clear about that and about the focus on equity, the focus on justice, and for the populations that you are working with. Consequential research has to be thought about with accountability to the people most affected by the problem. It has to be oriented toward change, not just understanding. That's what makes this framework useful for you as scholar practitioners. You are producing knowledge, right? That's part of becoming part of academia is producing knowledge and adding to the base of knowledge, but you're also designing studies with communities in contexts you're already part of with real people who will be affected by what you find and what you recommend. And that's the practitioner part of the scholar practitioner degree. There are three questions related to consequential research that I think are really worth highlighting. The first is who benefits from this research. The second is who is accountable to whom. And then maybe most importantly, what actually changes because this study was conducted. These questions are pushing us to take responsibility for our work in a way that goes beyond dissertation, that goes beyond showing that you can do research, and into the realm of doing practical research, applied research, consequential research. So Milner organizes his framework around six tenets. The first is understand and connect history. Designing consequential research requires deeply engaging with history and context as a resource. Understanding what has been studied, how, and with what effects helps researchers situate their work and avoid repeating harms. The second is respond to and advance the knowledge base. Consequential research responds to known problems, gaps, and injustices. Excuse me, and injustices. The third is to amplify researcher positionality. So this is connected to the next module, which we'll get into later. But positionality isn't just a statement that you put in your intro or in your methods section. It's a data point. Who you are shapes what you study, how you study it, and what you're able to see. The fourth is reject essentializing and polarizing. People and communities are not monoliths. Consequential research resists reducing complex people and situations to simple categories or predetermined conclusions. The fifth is prioritize voices of those most marginalized, not just including them as participants, but centering their voices as essential to knowledge construction through the entire research process. And then the sixth is consider multiple dissemination outlets. So this is built into the program a little bit in EDD 716 and 717, which happens at the end of the program. But this is something you need to start considering. The communities that you are working within and collaborating with, how what is the best way to get the findings to them in a way that makes an impact? So getting findings into a journal isn't enough. Consequential research acts, consequential research asks who actually needs to receive this knowledge and finds ways to reach them, whether that's practitioners, policymakers, communities, or the broader public. These six tenets aren't a checklist that you move through linearly. They're interconnected commitments that you're holding across the entire arc of your study. So I also want to talk through some of the core dimensions of doing applied impactful research, like the work that you are all doing. The first is staying close to the problem. So your research questions can drift toward what's theoretically interesting or what might be methodologically convenient or sample convenient, and slowly move away from the real urgent problem that got you started in the first place. So reconnecting with that is important. Um, Impactful research, consequential research resists that drift. A focus on problems of practice helps support that and aligns with that. The second is centering the people most affected. So, not just including them as participants, but treating them as stakeholders in the outcomes. That's a big difference between studying a community and being in relationship with one. And then the third is accountability, and that runs across the whole research process. It's not just about, I or B. It's about constantly asking, who am I accountable to here in my design and how I write up my findings and who I share them with. And then fourth is attending to context. So consequential research is refusing to strip away the historical, political, and cultural conditions that shape the problem. And decontextualized findings might look clean, right? They might meet the expectations of a methodology, but they often miss the point entirely. So you want to make sure that you are keeping your findings contextualized. And then the fifth is designing for impact, thinking from the beginning about how findings will be used by whom and to what end. So these are dimensions that fit with Milner's core tenets of consequential research, or fit with and build on, or build with. Okay, so I want to pause here for another quick check-in. In thinking about those dimensions, those key tenets of consequential research, which are listed here on this slide, what feels most natural to your framework? What will require the most intentional effort? Okay, so now I want to bring this back to your framework specifically. Does your framework just help you see, or does it also help you act or make recommendations for action? So a framework used analytically helps you interpret what's happening and why. That's important and it's valuable for the researcher and for the larger body of knowledge. But a framework used consequentially goes further to help you identify what needs to change and how you might move in that direction. It's important to remember that most of the frameworks that show up in research and in dissertations were not invented as neutral analytical lenses. Critical race theory, for example, was developed by legal scholars trying to dismantle systems of racial oppression. Culturally sustaining pedagogy was a direct challenge to deficit-oriented teaching. Transformative leadership theory was built around the idea that leadership has to do more than maintain the status quo. These frameworks have activist roots. They were built for change. And sometimes in the process of doing the academic work, of trying to meet the requirements of the degree, being rigorous, situating the framework carefully, we accidentally kind of sand off some of those edges. We make the framework feel more neutral than it actually is. So in this module, the point is to reconnect with what your framework was actually built to do and to connect that to the problem that you initially wanted to solve or study. So let's consider not just your framework, but your role and your goals in getting the EDD. So the EDD is a professional practice doctorate. You know that. You're not a researcher looking in from the outside. You're a leader embedded in the system that you're studying, and or that's what you plan to be in the future. Many of you already have positional access because you're already inside the institution. You also have relational accountability. So you have real relationships with people in your study or related to your study in some way that carry weight in history. And you have professional leverage. So your findings don't have to wait for a journal publication that comes up. It comes out 18 months from now. They can, at best, 18 months from now, they can inform solutions and decisions much more immediately than that. And that's powerful, but it can also create challenges. So, how do you study a system that you're part of? How do you make change within a system that's built to resist it? How do you write up findings that might be uncomfortable for your colleagues or your supervisor? Framing findings in terms of systems and structures rather than individuals helps, right? And a lot of your frameworks aim to do that. It shifts the conversation from, who failed, in quotes, to what needs to change. When you're holding your institution accountable while being part of it, this is where your theoretical framework can do some real work for you. A framework like transformative leadership or critical race theory gives you language and legitimacy to name structural problems that might all otherwise feel like personal criticism. And when thinking about how to change a system that's built to resist change, you have to consider what are the mechanisms of resistance? Who benefits from the status quo? What are the pressure points? So, a few things that actually move systems working at multiple levels simultaneously. Individual practice changes are easier to make, but they don't necessarily last without policy support. And then policy changes don't stick without individual buy-in and cultural shifts. So you need to be working on more than one level at a time, even if you're only pulling one level at a time or one lever at a time. Find your allies before you need them. So change doesn't happen alone. Who in the system shares your work, your viewpoint, even if they use a different language or they use a different terms to talk about what you're talking about in your dissertation and then the research that you do. Coalition building is slow. It's not super glamorous, but it is how things get done often. Um, Use the system's own language and values. If your institution cares about retention, frame equity as a retention issue. If it cares about accreditation, connect your argument to accreditation standards. That's strategy that you can use your framework to provide the language and the leverage points for you, but you can also then translate that to what the system you're working within values. Um, then name what's happening without burning bridges. There's a skill in being able to say this policy is producing inequitable outcomes without making people feel personally accused. Your framework can help here too. It can keep the analysis structural and it can provide the language for that. And then be honest about what you can't change right this moment. Consequential research doesn't require you to fix everything at the same time. It requires you to be honest about what you found, clear about what it means, and responsible about what you are recommending. Sometimes the most consequential thing that your dissertation does is name something clearly that everybody might have known, but nobody has documented yet. But oftentimes it goes further than that. So reflecting on these questions is part of what it means to do consequential research as a scholar practitioner. So as another check-in, what as a scholar practitioner, what is one specific way your research could lead to action in your professional context? So that may be a policy recommendation, program redesign, a conversation, really anything. So just think about that. Okay, now let's make this concrete with just a few examples, because sometimes this can feel a little abstract until you see it in action or until you actually start doing it. So, the P12 example, a principal studying disciplinary disparities for Black male students using critical race theory. There are a lot of studies that document disparities. They find them, they name them, they may put them in a table, and that's important work. But to go beyond that to make the study even more consequential is what it can do beyond documentation. So, in this case, the study produces equity-centered discipline protocols that would be co-developed with students, families, and or teachers and presented to the school board. That framework then is not just shaping the analysis, it's shaping the output and who the research is for. The community college example, LAC Crit is going to push that researcher to look at institutional structures, not just student experiences, which leads to very specific recommendations, a dedicated counselor, revised intake questions that reduce the surveillance dimension of those interactions. And then the leadership example, transformative leadership theory is going to point towards systemic causes of burnout, not individual ones, which means the recommendations are systemic too. In all three cases, the framework is doing active work for the researcher. It's shaping what counts as a finding, who the findings are addressed to, and what actions are possible as a result of the study. And here's some additional examples that lean on specific theoretical frameworks. Take a look at what they all have in common. In every case, the researcher isn't just analyzing, they're doing something with what they found. They're drafting a protocol, proposing a policy change, redesigning a program, recommending a structural audit. The framework is what makes that possible because it tells you not just what is happening, but what should be different and why, and sometimes how. So take the critical disability theory, for example. A purely analytical move would be to document the barriers that students with disabilities face, and that's valuable. But a consequential move goes a little bit further to ask, are we locating the problem in the right place? Critical disability theory says the problem isn't the student, it's the system, and that reframe changes what your recommendations look like. Or sense-making theory. Instead of just describing how teachers were confused by a policy rollout, you use the framework to pinpoint exactly where meaning broke down and redesign the process itself. That framework becomes a diagnostic tool, not just an interpretive one. So here's the question I want you to think about for your own work. What does your framework make possible, um, that wouldn't be visible without it? What does it let you see or name or recommend that a neutral description of the problem couldn't? That's what you need to be able to articulate, as you move forward with these frameworks. All right, so we're almost done. A quick preview of where we're headed. Next week is positionality, or the next module is positionality. And I want you to notice the thread connecting these two modules because it's intentional. You can't do consequential research without being honest about who you are, what you bring, your biases, the limitations, the strengths, of your position in relation to the work that you're doing, and what you owe to your participants and communities. So positionality isn't just a formality that you put in chapter 1 or chapter 3 and forget about it. It's an ongoing practice. So carry what you've been thinking about, throughout this presentation, thinking about the scholar practitioner as a change agent and your framework as a tool for action. You'll carry that forward into your positionality work next module. Let's just talk briefly about the assignment before we close out. I want to be clear about what I'm actually asking you to do here because it is a little bit different from the work that you've been doing. I want you to push past analysis and into this kind of realm of imagination, right? Think about what could be different in your institution, in your field, because of your study. And the key word here is to be specific, or the key idea here is to be specific. Saying my framework will help me understand systemic inequity is not the same as saying my framework will help me identify what specific policies are producing inequitable outcomes, and here's how I would present that to a decision maker. Vague connections between theory and practice, it's just not as useful for you. So be trying to really think through ahead of time before you get to the discussion section of, what your framework has specifically helped you to identify as next steps, solutions, actions. That's what you're aiming for. What you figure out here, feeds directly into your implications and recommendation sections. You're not just doing an assignment, you're building kind of the scaffolding for the part of your dissertation that answers the key question of, okay, great, so what? Or now what? Right. So in closing, think about what your framework helps you do and the kind of change that it can help you make. How is your framework connected to action? What action does your framework make possible? So complete this sentence, yeah, I guess it's a sentence. My framework doesn't just help me understand blank. It also helps me blank, do, change, recommend, challenge, build. All right. See you next module.